This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 373, Performance, Privacy, and the Open Web. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we are talking about performance, privacy, and the open web with Andrey Lipattsev and Tim Lehnen. Andrey is a strategic partner manager for privacy and Chrome at Google, a longtime admirer of the open web, and an aspiring friend of the Drupal community. Welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here.
And Tim is the CTO of the Drupal Association, returning guest, and he's here to represent Drupal's perspective. Welcome back to the show, Tim.
Good to be back.
I'm Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development, and today my co-hosts are, as usual, John Picozzi, solution architect at EPAM.
Hi, everyone.
And joining us again, Randy Oss, the creative director of Four Kitchens and product lead of Emulsify. Thank you for joining us again.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so we do have a community update. So elections are on everybody's mind today because today is election day in the United States. But we have the resolution of another election. The Drupal Association at-large board election winner was Nikki Flores. So thank you for everybody.
Yay.
Thank you everybody that participated, and looking forward to see what ideas she comes up with.
It's going to be great having her on the board. I'm looking forward to one of my, let's see, this is another 1/14 of my bosses joining in. It should be a lot of fun.
Now, do you keep track, Tim? Do you have like a board of how many bosses you've had, like 1/14 bosses you've had?
Well, when you go through boards and executive directors and all those things, it's better not to keep track.
Fair enough.
We also have a quick announcement. NEDCamp is going to be, is it the week
this coming weekend?
Yeah. The week that this comes out. So definitely looking forward to seeing everybody.
If you're listening to this and it's a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday, go buy your tickets. NEDCamp's happening on Friday and Saturday, the 18th and 19th. There's a training day on Friday, a session day on Saturday. We have a fun community event Friday night, open to the public. You can come. You don't have to have a conference ticket. And then sessions and an after party on Saturday. Come to NEDCamp.
Awesome. And we have a new module of the week that I'm looking forward to hearing about. What do you got for us, Martin?
So this week, we're going to be talking about Entity Autocomplete Anchor, which is actually a module that was nominated by one of our listeners and a previous guest on the show, Mathieu, who is himself a maintainer of a number of interesting and useful modules. So Entity Autocomplete Anchor really provides a widget that allows a content author to basically add an anchor to an entity reference link. It's a module that was just created earlier this year in April of 2022. Currently, it has a 1.0 beta 3 release that supports Drupal 9, and the most recent release was released in May 24th of this year. It's not widely used. It's currently shows 9 sites using it, but it does list the United Nations as a supporting organization.
That's a clue. That's a clue about the scale of the sites that are probably using it.
Exactly. So in terms of how it works, it basically has your sort of standard autocomplete entity reference field, but it adds a field to specify an anchor, so a destination within the page where a user will be taken, when they click on that link. It's also worth noting that if someone is already using the Link It module, which was mentioned briefly in last week's show and was actually covered, I think, as module of the week in episode 327, there actually is an RTBC issue about adding anchor support to Link It. So if your site is already using that module, then you might be able to sort of add some of this capability there as well. So maybe just open it up to the group here. Has anybody had to use this kind of anchor linking strategy with entity reference links, or maybe had other sort of very specific linking needs in a Drupal site they worked on?
Well, the funny thing is, we don't do anything like this from a technical point of view, but it could be potentially pretty useful because, on Drupal.org's documentation system, we're automatically generating these anchor links across documentation sections and groups. And all these groups, of course, are based on entity reference. So when we're moving people around the contributor guide or module documentation or things like that, I feel like something like this actually could be a big time saver. So that could be cool. Yeah, that's neat. It seems like it's one of those great examples of something that seems like such a small feature, but is actually super, super useful. So,
yeah, I mean, it solves like I have workaround solutions for this for a lot of clients where like just the template outputs like the ID and some sort of thing so that the customer can create anchor links to things when they need to. But that, you're using the ID in that case, which is a messy, like you never want to go to an anchor link that's like comp-14772, right? This allows and they're outputting that for every single component on the page when it's template level, right? Whereas this allows you, like, if they need the anchor link, they can create it and they can put some marketing behind it. They can name it whatever they need to name it. So it looks nice. So I'll actually be looking at installing this for a couple of clients right away. It's also got more, I don't know when you wrote these notes, but it's got 13 websites now. So it's almost a 50% increase.
Some additional nations saw that the UN was using it and decided, hey, let's add this to the Ireland.gov site.
Honestly,
which I'm not sure.
It really could be, just because one of the things I really wish we had in our stats was the size of the sites and not just the number of sites, because these days that's often a more important indicator with the scale that some of these Drupal sites are at.
And the support.
Yeah. I can say, I'm absolutely going to use this. I've got a client right now who was asking about making internal links to be able to link deep on a page. And we're like, well, we can totally do that, but it's going to be a little bit janky. And this might make it a lot less janky. So I'm looking forward to being number 14.
So this may be a dumb question, so brace yourselves, listeners, and everybody else. Does it allow you to kind of link to kind of any ID on the page, or is it specifically just, do you need to place an anchor within your content in order to go to that point?
Excellent question. I mean, to my knowledge, it's really a text field. So potentially you could maybe try and do, sometimes in Google search results, it uses this weird sort of very custom format that I don't know if other browsers besides Chrome work with it, but basically it allows linking to specific text within a page. So theoretically, you might be able to get that to work, but I think it's really designed for sort of more traditional.
There's a list of supported attributes from the link attributes widget, which I assume would all be compatible with this, and that's got ARIA labels and titles and access keys and all sorts of more obscure stuff.
So I wonder if you're using this, going back to our show last week with the CK editor guys, I mentioned the anchor widget within CK editor. I'm wondering if you would necessarily need this in order to complement this module to be able to put anchors into your content as you were writing it.
It's a thought.
Work well together, yeah.
Site number 14 will tell us, right?
There you go.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Martin, for this suggestion. I actually might watch the usage statistics on this one for the first time just to see, to watch it tick up. But yeah, excellent module of the week. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and if any listeners have other modules that they want to nominate, by all means, drop them in the Talking Drupal channel on Drupal Slack.
Awesome. Okay, so moving on to our primary topic this week. So Tim, there's performance and privacy in the open web is a big topic. And it's something that's been on our minds a lot. And the idea for this show actually came up when you were a guest host a few weeks ago. Can you tell us a little bit more about what's behind performance, privacy, and the open web?
Yeah, as you said, it's potentially a really huge topic because these are all really important things that I think are on everyone's mind. We'll dig into some of the details here, but I think, frankly, this is something that we can have an ongoing conversation about here on the podcast, in the community at large, in the Drupal space, but also in the open source community at large. I think it's going to be really important. But more specifically, let me break down sort of each of those three categories into some problem spaces that we want to talk about. So when it comes to performance, one of the ways to frame the conversation is we're really talking about performance as it impacts sort of user experience, as it affects our end users of Drupal, as it affects people in the developing world using the web, as it affects kind of the ability of applications to interoperate with each other. And one of the things that we really need to think about is not just necessarily sort of raw backend performance, but also front-end performance, sort of that perceived snappiness and ease of use, that app-like behavior. Because one of the threats to the open web is that everybody moves to app ecosystems. They use their Facebook pages instead of building a website. They, all these different kinds of things where they could kind of opt out of sort of participating in sort of the more open web. And believe it or not, just the pure performance of how a website works can have a big impact on that. So that's one area where we want to talk about this. On the privacy side, that's obviously on everyone's minds, particularly since the GDPR regulations went into effect and then other nations and states began adding their own regulations to manage privacy, but also, again, just to respond to kind of the, I don't want to say dystopian future that we could be facing, but this notion that we want to control our data and control our experience. And how do we do that on the web? How does that compare to what we're currently doing in application ecosystems and in other places? And how do people who want to promote an open web ecosystem work together with folks who have a lot of control over the space, like folks at Google? And then lastly, speaking of the open web in general, I think we're all aware of kind of the implosion currently going on at Twitter, which brings to mind all these questions about, well, we had all of our eggs in a proprietary social media basket. What are the consequences of that? Things can change very rapidly. So where can we have robust and strong open web solutions, not just in social media, but also in publishing and with CMS solutions like Drupal or whatever else it may be, so that we have a variety of more independent voices, more sort of controlled and self-published voices? And how does the technology impact the adoption of that? Because I go back to my earlier example. If your open web solutions are hard to implement and janky, people will still opt for the proprietary stuff, because in the end, the ease of use will trump those greater concerns until there's that kind of implosion. So, I think that sets the stage.
Interesting. Okay, so let's break that down into its three, buckets, right? Let's start by talking about web performance. This is going to be kind of an easy question, because we all kind of know about web performance. But Andrey, what's meant by web performance?
Thanks for setting me up like that. Was an easy one. Well, first of all, I'm going to say that web performance probably doesn't mean what you think it does. And I will also just ruin everything, including the name of the episode, by saying it's not actually performance. And Tim has alluded to this. It's user experience, of which performance is a part that we really care about here. Although, however, depending on how you want to approach it, we might call performance just applies to really everything. And a website that is performing is a website that delivers the users the information and the services and the products that they came looking for. And so in that sense, we can probably use that as a coverall term as well, just equivalent to user experience. However, if we want to get a little bit more technical than this, I would say that, let's start with there's no single place to start, but let's start with this. The Chrome team uses over 200 metrics to track user experience, and has been for years. And tweaks the browser's code itself to optimize, to compress, to predict, and do other interesting, cool things to improve the overall user experience on Chrome. However, a huge chunk of that experience is in the hands of the developers and the owners of the websites. So for the longest time, it was felt necessary to come up with a way to share this measurable approach with web developers in a way that's not overwhelming. Because if you start asking everybody to track 200 different metrics, you're not setting yourself up for success. So an approach was chosen to select a few that are reasonably I was about to say all-encompassing, and then I caught myself. Not all-encompassing, but reasonably broad and cover the widest possible range of aspects of user experience, and somewhat mutually independent. They're all interrelated, but at least somewhat mutually independent, where changing one shouldn't necessarily affect the others, and therefore so all of them combined give you a good overall picture without being too detailed, and yet being detailed enough to give you meaningful information and quantifiable. And that's how the Chrome team landed on the concept of core web vitals. If this is the first time that we're mentioning them. What are they? I mean, there's, first of all, the word core, right, implies that there's also non-core, and that's true, right? There's a bunch of web vitals metrics. There's probably about just short of a dozen of them. I'm not going to cover them all in any detail. You can look them up, and we'll drop some links in the show notes as well. But the core ones are 3 for now, right? And that list can also change, and that's important. We'll come to this as well. The 3 that were chosen cover visual stability. I'm actually starting at the end, but let's do this backwards. Covers visual stability, which is an essential element of experience. It's easy to understand for anybody in the most layman's terms. If the web page you're on is jumping all over the place without your control, it's not a great experience. Then it's the interactivity of the page. And that's a tricky one to measure. And for example, right now we're using something called first input delay. There's other attempts in the works to see if there's a better way to approach this measurement, but you clearly understand that we need to measure this somehow. We need to understand how quickly the content on the page itself, how well it leaves. Like it's a living entity. It needs to respond to the user in a way that makes the user feel engaged. And so we need to measure that somehow, and we're trying. So for now, what we're trying with FID is basically measuring how long it takes from a button that's been pressed or clicked to do something, more or less. I mean, there's a technical definition to this, so we can dive into this. And then, since I'm going backwards, the appearance, the first visual appearance of the content that you actually came for to the page is probably an essential element of the experience. Because if you're not seeing what you came there to see, then you're not having an experience at all. So these 3 things, the paint and the appearance of the content, the interactivity of that content, and the stability of the experience that you're having, are what is covered by Core Web Vitals, and is supposed to be representative of a large enough slice of user experience to be meaningful, to track and improve, and can be quantified with user data.
That's really interesting because, like, everybody always talks about performance, right? My website needs to be fast. Google's looking at my website. It needs to be fast because it's going to help my SEO. But very rarely do they think, and maybe this is changing, right? Hopefully it's changing because what you just said makes a lot of sense, right? Like, hopefully it's changing to like, hey, if my website isn't usable, button clicks take a long time, it loads slowly. Yeah. As you said, things are moving all over the screen. They'll realize that like the bigger performance picture is super important, as opposed to just like page speed.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because that you bring that up. I was actually talking about this with a client earlier when we were talking about some usability issues, and IMDb has, I think, a really good example of a performant page that like what you would traditionally say this is performant because it loads quickly, but isn't performant from a usability perspective. So if you ever have used their episode guide, it is a frustrating experience because what happens is you click on a season and the list of all the episodes load and you see, oh, I want to click on episode 4, right? You move your mouse down on the screen to click on episode 4. And then IMDb in the background is loading details about all these episodes. And just about the time you get your mouse to episode 4 to click on it, it loads in those details and the entire list
runs away from you.
And then you end up clicking on episode 2, which isn't the episode you wanted to look at. So then you have to go back and then you have to wait for the list to load again. Then you have to wait for the details to load so that you can actually click on the episode you want. Whereas if they just had that delay and just loaded everything at once, it might actually take longer for the page to paint, but it's a more performant site because you're not clicking, first of all, you're not clicking twice or 3 times on the wrong thing. You're not waiting, you're not waiting 10 seconds looking at the screen, waiting for the thing to load that is going to load. So it's an interesting thing when you tie that back to accessibility or usability rather. That can be performance. Like it probably would take 200 milliseconds longer to just load that in the first request versus doing it as an AJAX call. But it would make that page way more performant.
And there's
Are you saying that you don't like the IMDb adventure game that they gave you? Like, like you make a selection, they make it jump, like, it's like the old Atari game, Pitfall, like jumping over crocodiles to get to the IMDb information you need.
Well, and what's interesting, right, is there are techniques that don't have to, and now I'm borrowing from some of the stuff that Andrey has talked about at the workshop at DrupalCon, which we'll get into a little bit too, but there are techniques that you can use where it's like, it's not that you necessarily even have to delay your payload for a full page paint. You can create layout stability where effectively you have enough placeholder spacing for where those details will load. So if you do go ahead and click, you want to go in and click episode 4 before the details have loaded, you can do that. But also if you wait, it's not going to jump because that that div spacing is already in place and it's already ready to go. So there's ways you can have the best of both worlds. And this is really interesting to me also, right? You can go to web.dev where the core web vitals are documented, and you can put in a site and get, right? So there's multiple ways people can measure this if they want to, right, Andrey? So one is you can just do a site audit right from that site. And then you can use a variety of tools that the Chrome team and others have provided if you want to install sort of more robust options. But I welcome folks to feel free to put in Drupal.org. It's not a great example on the performance side, although I will say our accessibility score is extremely good. But it is an interesting way to get a sense of what some of these metrics are and compare against a site that maybe you're used to using from a usability perspective, and see how this lines up. Because in the end, as engineers, we often think, okay, measurement of performance, like it's like we're racing servers against each other, and we're forgetting that the ultimate purpose of this is to foster a good experience of the people using it. So just remembering which metric we're putting first.
In your defense, and since we're focusing on CLS so much, which I, by the way, I love, this is my favorite metric. If you have ever seen me talk about this before, you know that this is my metric of joy, right? This is the one that people tend to ignore. Drupal.com at the origin level has a CLS of 0. So you respect your users, and I thank you for it.
Yeah.
Sorry,
for our listeners, CLS stands for what again?
Cumulative layout shift. That's exactly what we've been talking about.
The cumulative layout shift.
Describing is the layout. Hopefully, it's in the name, right? It's the layout is shifting without the user doing something. And there's actually some math behind it. You can read up exactly how long does it have to be between an interaction and the shift for it to be considered a user-generated interaction versus a non-user generated one. And so what you've been describing is exactly that. It's layout shifting, and it's the calculation is so simple. I don't know why we haven't done it before, right? Actually, it's been some years. But why wasn't it there from the start? It's literally by how much has the content on the screen shifted by respect with the size of the screen, and that's it, right? And so you can it's simplistic on the one hand, but it's something you can really zoom in on. And on the other hand, it also allows you to think, well, you know what? If I'm in the area of like a 1% shift, which is almost imperceptible, maybe slightly annoying, but not too critical, and I'm okay. If I'm starting to get into the sort of the double digits of percentage shifts, they can cause exactly the experience that you've been referring to, where you're misclicking on things.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So I'd like to kind of like come back around. You went through and mentioned some of the core vitals that the Chrome team looks at. I'm kind of curious what some of the non-core vitals look like. What are some examples of those? I mean, I'm not looking for a list of all the like 197 that you didn't list, but
there's literally just about 8 or 9 that are considered web vitals, but are not part of the core in terms of, I didn't mention this because again, it's back to the concept of not expecting all developers everywhere to be able to optimize with multiple things at once, which is probably also impossible. But to give you one example of a thing that is closely looked at, but is not considered one of the core, is as opposed to the largest contentful pane that we talked about, like the main piece of content by screen size, more or less, that the user came to the website for. You can also look at the first contentful paint. So when did anything get painted on the page, which is also interesting, right? You got the time to first byte as well, which is when did the first byte arrive? And then when was this first byte actually, well, not this, some byte brought to the screen? But both of these are interesting, but again, they're more interesting to some degree, maybe from a sort of a back-end and engineering perspective of like how quickly am I communicating device to device, not so much yet with the eyeballs of the user, or maybe not even the eyeballs, right? We can think about accessibility. So with any means through which the user is interacting with the page, how quickly am I delivering that to them? So that's the difference here. So you have some other ones which are also kind of maybe fitting into it, because you can't have a largest contentful paint without the first contentful paint, right? And you can have to optimize both, and maybe it's your server loading time that's actually slowing everything down. And if you bring down your TTFB, your time to first byte, you'll improve your largest contentful paint. But maybe in many cases, your TTFB is amazing and you're doing great in terms of server responses, but you're loading a 9 gigabyte PNG image as your main content, right? And,
as a designer, I would never, ever do that again.
No, I mean, the last time I
Again.
on the webpage was just like 5 seconds ago. It's like, yeah, never happened.
Yeah. I cut that again.
I think what Randy was saying there is it's okay to do it once.
Yeah, I mean, right? Just like, oh no, it's fine. 9 megabyte image.
Remember, people hold first impressions for a long time, Randy. Even if it's a 9 megabyte PNG.
Yeah.
Andrey, let's talk a little bit about benefits, right? So obviously there are obvious benefits to like web performance and having good core vitals, right? Like, hey, your users are happy because your site loads fast, or it's performant, so on and so forth. But what are some of the benefits that aren't obvious, right? So one that I keep thinking of, and feel free not to answer this question because but like, do these things help your ranking in Google? Is that something that Google's looking at when it's saying like, oh, this website's like a reputable source, or like somebody that should be higher in the page ranking and so on and so forth?
You really make me torn between being a little bit facetious and also respectful, and I'm going to try to tread the middle ground between those two.
I mean, we like facetious, so
yeah. Well,
you do you.
Disclaimer, right? I'm not from the search team. So not qualified, not authorized to talk about search rankings at all. Like even in private life, I try to avoid it because I've also interesting maybe a bit about me. I did that for 6 years, then I moved on, and it's been a while. So you might know me from my previous life as a search quality specialist. No longer. Great job. I'm glad I'm not doing it anymore, because then you get to talk about things like this, and they get really quickly. So, well, I'll say what's publicly available, what's out there on this topic, so it's clear. Google search uses Cover Vital scores as measured in the wild, so not measured by Googlebot or anything, as collected from real users, anonymized and so on. So there's no personal information leaking there. So Google search uses that as part of their page experience algorithm element. So you can look that up. We'll put it in the show notes. I think there's a blog post about it, which explains what other elements are present in the algorithm. So very importantly, it's not like Cover Vitals are somehow the end all and be all of a sudden of ranking number 1 or number 101. Just read the blog post. What we'll also add to the show notes, and what I'm a lot more excited to talk about, is the direct business impact. Because I mean, again, talking about facetious thing, who cares which position you're ranking in? Who cares how many users you get to your website if nobody's buying anything, if nobody's doing anything? Okay, you might be the United Nations and you're not selling, bicycles. You're still selling something. You're selling yourself. You're selling the interaction. Yep. You don't want to call it selling, call it whatever you want. You are engaging the users in some meaningful way, to subscribe to your blog, to donate to your course, to participate, to engage. In fact, you know what? I would even say that this is more critical for non-commercial organizations that are trying to engage people, because if you really want to buy a bicycle, maybe you'll stick around to buy a bicycle. But if you're looking to just maybe have been tangentially engaged in a sort of in a benevolent cause, and you're not sure, having a horrible experience when you're trying to get in there might be the thing that puts you off, right? I don't know. Like it's an example of the top of my head, but basically, you'll see a study in the show notes which draws correlation, causation, but it seems to strongly indicate a very strong relationship between the overall user experience on the site as measured by Cover Vitals and business indicators. And we have multiple case studies on web.dev where you can kind of go, I drove that up, my bounce rate went down, my engagement rates went up, people read more pages, people maybe add more stuff to the cart, maybe people re-engage with the cart and so on. That's what you need to care about. Yes, you need to care about SEO and bringing people to your resource, but you also must care about keeping them there and getting them to do what you get them there in the first place.
I mean, I think that's a great point, because I mean, we've all heard, right? And this is like for ages, right? People that have been doing e-commerce have heard like, hey, like a frictionless experience is going to help you sell more of X, whatever X is, right? And like, it makes sense. Like, hey, if two vendors are next to each other and one vendor has like a huge problem, right, with their website that causes people pain, they're not going to go there, right? So I think the fact that you have statistics to back this up, and you can look at the data and say like, hey, this is like obviously true, but it's also statistically true, and here's how. And then you can quantify that to people that may have similar sites, right? To say like, well, your competitor here, maybe you're probably not sharing that data, but like they could look it up maybe. Your competitor here is doing this better than you. Right?
No. In fact, you know what? Let me just sort of point people in the right direction here, talking about competitors.
Yeah, absolutely.
As much as Chrome can meaningfully share publicly and with respect to user privacy and anonymity. Let me run you through some of the details. I mean, not just you, everybody who's listening to us. So what do we got here? Every Google session, if the user has opted into that, gets logged. So all the things that are firing off, all the events firing off on the page get logged, right? If with user permission. Then, if there are enough user sessions on any given page over any given time period to be able to provide this data back with anonymity, so there's been basically this above some threshold which allows us to introduce enough noise for this to be non-identifiable, you have a data set of all the pages known to Chrome, all the sessions on all those pages over time, and it's publicly available. First of all, it's publicly available as raw data. Jump into BigQuery, knock yourself out, find competitors, find platforms, whatever. We also make it somewhat easier for everybody, hopefully. First of all, Tim's already mentioned this pagespeed.web.dev, where you can just input any URL, your URL, anybody's URL, and see the results right there, if they're available, right? For some sites with some pages and some sites with lower amounts of traffic, you might not see it there for exactly the reasons I explained. But for larger websites, definitely, you'll see yourself, you'll see your competitors, you'll see your grandma's website, anything you like, right? It's number one. And then number two, on a platform level, and we'll drop that in the show notes as well for those who are interested, we are publishing a Web Vitals technology report, which compares platforms. So it compares the comparison you do yourself, but there's data available per CMS, framework, even specific plugins on certain in some of the ecosystems, right? So you can do comparisons of you compare Drupal with Wix or a particular module.
No comparison.
Don't use Wix. Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, I brought it up. It was the first thing that popped in my mind. Anything. Right? But the reason I picked it up is because there's other open source CMSs, and there's an interesting dynamic between them. And there's a really interesting, from my perspective, because I'm an outsider looking in, there's an interesting dynamic and perspective in the changes and the developments between the open source and sort of commercially owned, entirely owned CMSs as well, and how they've been developing and what changes have been happening there. And if you check it out, definitely check out the Web Vitals technology report and see some of the dynamics there and how some ecosystems have been really shooting up in terms of performance. And you can also trace the history a little bit of how and why that happened, and some others didn't. And it will be interesting to see over the coming years what impact this has on the usage. Drupal, for example, Drupal's doing really good. Really good.
So, Andrey, there's something that I'm extremely curious about. So, as a web developer, at least for the last 10 years or so, performance has been very important for me. And one of the things is you try to identify slow pages, for whatever definition of slow that we're using, and make them more performant. But it's always kind of a site by site or page by page project. So I might take some learnings from one project and apply them to the next, right? But I'm curious, from a platform level like Chrome, how is the Chrome team approaching performance? Because you can publish something like, hey, this pattern in JavaScript is very slow, you shouldn't follow that. But there's also the side like, hey, maybe there's a way to, when you're talking about the JavaScript engine, for example, maybe you can interpret that pattern differently and make it faster. How is performance approached from a platform or a browser level on the Chrome team? How do you try to, is it all just measuring it and trying to publish this stuff? Or are you guys also saying like, how can we make this interpretation faster?
I think the short version of the answer here is definitely yes, both, for sure, right? So Chrome over time has introduced a whole range of optimizations to the way pages are being rendered, so they can be delivered, so the bytes can be delivered faster. And this is exactly what this is exactly related to where we started the conversation about Core Vitals, where they came from. All the internal metrics that Chrome looks at, first and foremost, were introduced to understand what Chrome can do about that, right? What Chrome can do to help the delivery of contentful panes and processing of JavaScript and all that. To me, though, then keep in mind, I'm not a developer on the Chrome team, right? So maybe have to fall back to some of my engineering colleagues and look up some of their talks, try to find some good ones on this for you in the show notes. I think the realization is that we need to be in this together. And I think this is, in fact, this is a great tie-in and where we can talk about the work we've been doing together with Drupal and why. Right? Because you don't want to push the entire load of development, the entire load of improvement onto developers. However, certain things are certainly in their hands. Where we feel there's an opportunity to balance this responsibility and balance this load is by working with platforms that enable developers. And Drupal is certainly an amazing example of that, right? Where you have areas that require attention and could ostensibly be dealt with by an individual developer. Or a great example of this specifically is lazy loading. Like you could theoretically dive into your Drupal code and manually change things. But what you could also do is you could think of ways to improve this at the platform level for everybody. Right, and we've been investing in this together with some amazing folks from Tech One and Drupal and some others over the past year to make it available just for everybody. And again, there's a link to the GitHub repo of the stuff we've been working on in the show notes, and you can see for yourselves the kind of things we've now made more generally available as tooling for Drupal developers. And this is the approach, right? This is part of the approach. So you got the part of where the browser itself is trying to improve itself while competing with other browsers. But I think more essentially, since Chrome is not the only browser in the world, right? And that's amazing. You need to be up-leveling the entire web platform. And you do that by working with platforms like Drupal so that it becomes easier to do the right thing.
Yeah. I think what was remarkable to me was, I think it goes back to maybe 2018. I can't remember. The Google hosted for the first time a CMS Leadership Summit about 4 or 5. Huh? Forum.
It's called the CMS Leadership Forum, but yes.
Yes, CMS Leadership Forum. Like 4 or 5 years ago, they hosted one for the first time, and it was really interesting because they brought together, it was about 50% open source platforms and about 50% proprietary commercial platforms, and that wasn't based on a deliberate, we want half and half. As I understood it, it was based on Google knowing that these were the platforms that were publishing up to 50% of what was being indexed in Google of the web, and brought those people together to actually talk about problem solving. And to me, that was a remarkable sort of sea change in the kind of interaction and collaboration between open source projects like Drupal and between an organization like Google, which kind of is at the browser end and the search end of this experience, right? And there was a lot that we did in the past that was, two ships passing each other in the night, where it's like, well, we're doing what we think our understanding of Google was, and Google does things so that they think their understanding of open source projects and these platforms do. And we got into a real dialogue. And I just want to echo what Andrew said. It makes so much sense to collaborate on the things that will empower people to put in place the best practices most easily. And those are not just developer practices, because we go back to, hey, you added that, 9 megabyte ping file, right? Like, updating, Drupal is modern versions now have image styles that can be predefined to help prevent your regular content editors from accidentally posting images that are too large, and now can have those be lazy load by default, and all sorts of other things. So it's a little bit of a way of just how do we make this experience-based performance engineering not a specialty discipline, but something that can be more easily built in and shared across every little thing that we're doing, so that you don't evaluate it as a separate task. It's just part of each component of your platform.
And I have found an example. I was furiously Googling just to make sure that I'm not talking out of some inappropriate part of my body. But WebP, there's an example for you. WebP was introduced by Google back in 2010, and I did not know the date, so I had to find it out. But yes, the WebP as an image format that helps us move away to some degree from PNGs where it's appropriate was introduced. It's not enough to introduce a format and say, hey, now there's a much better way to put images on the web. You need to get people to be able to use it. And the work that folks on Drupal did to implement support for WebP was critical for this, right? And you just see adoption of WebP going up and up with more and more platforms making it easier to use this type of images. So that's the synergy right there. That definitely.
And in an open source spirit, we've worked with people at WordPress, at Typo3, at Joomla, like a number of these people. And in several cases, even though they were open source projects, I hadn't had the chance to build relationships with them until we were together at the Leadership Forum, because we were finally in a room together. And so, when we talk about WebP or AVIF or some of these other image optimization things, like the project that started as an early collaboration with Google to say, hey, can we provide that support in the Drupal ecosystem, actually turned into, can we get that support upstream in PHP? Because PHP itself needed it. And so now the whole PHP ecosystem in the latest versions supports these new, much more highly optimized image formats, thanks to the work that the Drupal community wanted to do to implement this. And that will go into all of these platforms. So like those are the kinds of collaborations that I think are so crucial.
Yeah. And I just want to call out too, that this kind of collaboration is a bit unique in that it's one of those things that it truly helps every party, right?
Yes.
I mean, making more performant and accessible sites helps Google because, if they're providing those results to people are more likely to use Google as their platform of choice, right? Having a more accessible and performant site for the user is, I mean, by definition, an improvement.
Exactly. By definition, a win for them.
For the user. Having a more performant CMS like Drupal or a more accessible CMS like Drupal is better for developers and for client. Like it's less effort as a developer to make it accessible if it's more accessible out of the box. It's better for our customers because the experience that their customers are going to have will be better. So it truly is one of those collaborations that every level way down, this type of collaboration, it just helps make the world a better place, on some level.
It's collaboration all the way down.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just one of those things where it can't be overstated how valuable it is for us to not be right. It's very much in the spirit of open source, and this goes back to the larger open web kind of a mission. What kind of web do we want? Do we want the sort of web where 25% of the internet that people use was actually one service that was just bought by one billionaire who's having a bad mental health day, and now, wow, that's going to be tough? Or do we want a web that's like built on really solid foundations and that people can independently partake in? And I just find it really interesting that this sort of collaboration allows open source projects to collaborate with each other, to collaborate with proprietary ecosystems as well, to just, again, to say, hey, we want WebP to be a thing. So we want that to be a thing for everybody, not just us. But also in some ways it helps open source as a movement participate beyond its specific project, right? This is a kind of collaboration where we're not just talking about Drupal. We are making Drupal more competitive on the web as a result of this, but this is an area where we're working with Drupal as part of a larger open web movement. And that's really gratifying.
I love to hear all of this, and this is something that, like, I personally use the term nutritious work. It's like work that feeds the soul. I want to kind of focus a little bit, like take, all the hand holding through all the ecosystems is great, but Tim, I'd like to kind of know a little bit more about the performance tuning that D.O does, and like how has that helped?
Yeah, that's a great question, because first of all, there's a lot more for us to do, and there's more things that Drupal.org itself can do. So as some of the folks on this call may know, Drupal.org is still in the midst of our upgrade to modern Drupal. We're still a Drupal 7 site, and we have 3 sites that are pre-production ready for Drupal 9, or probably actually 10 by the time they launch. And some other things going on. And, Drupal.org's primary focuses have been on, robust caching configurations, CDN configurations, and then in particular focusing on the kind of mobile first, accessible first user interaction patterns that are like clean, simple. We don't have layout shift, as Andrey mentioned earlier, right? Those sorts of things. That said, we do still have a lot that we could do, right? We still have a lot that we could do in terms of page renders and image optimization, especially. Those are like major areas that affect, first contentful paint and time to interactive. Those kinds of things are still issues with Drupal.org itself that I think will get significantly better with our next launches. So one of the nice things is, again, if anybody out there wants to use Drupal.org as a guinea pig or punching bag or anything like that when they're checking out web dev, it produces a list of opportunities, right? So it says, hey, here's the thing that we think it will be most impactful, like deferring the loading of images that are off screen. We have a lot of fairly long landing pages, especially in the sort of front end marketing areas of Drupal.org. Where, like, until you've scrolled, there's a bunch of images that don't need to load, all sorts of things. Its next recommendation is next-gen image formats, like this AVIF and WebP support that we've been working on. So it'll be cool to use.
You also tell it to be lazy load, like there's a lazy load attribute in HTML now.
Yeah, there is. And in fact, I'll link it in the show notes as well. I just dropped it down there. That was added to Drupal core.
Yeah.
By this collaboration with the Google team. So when it's in there by default once we've got our 9 upgrade. So there's a lot of really cool stuff in there, and it'll be nice to make D.O sort of a case study for that stuff.
So you guys kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier. I mean, you were talking about the lazy loading collaboration, but it sounds like there's some new collaboration that's been happening too, as recently as the most recent DrupalCon. Can you tell us a little bit about that as well? Like what's coming up? What can we look forward to?
Yeah, well, let me start with a couple things, and I'll hand it to Andrey, because unfortunately, literally like 5 days before DrupalCon Prague, I got COVID and couldn't get on the plane. So he can talk more specifically about what happened there, because I heard it was a standing room only kind of situation. But speaking more generally about the collaboration, we've been trying to do a number of things. Like between the Google team and the Drupal Association, we have been trying to identify high impactful areas that improve the experience of Drupal and the web for everybody, just like we've just said. And so that's been things like image opt, lazy load. We've been talking about other potential performance areas. We've been exploring some things around privacy. We'll get to those a little bit in later topics, but basically just trying to create that sort of hit list of potential areas. One of the things we'd like to do is we'd like to engage the community further in issues of privacy and performance, to say, hey, does the Drupal community, which has done some really cool projects with some really important web properties around the world, are you aware of? Do you out there listening, do you have key ideas for things that are important to the web that would be good for everyone at large? So that's a part of it as well. But speaking of DrupalCon, Andrey, why don't you talk about, well, first of all, I think it was your first DrupalCon, so maybe your general experience, and then specifically what we were doing there.
Well, no, first of all, it was an absolute pleasure being there. And, I can't thank you all enough for having me there. It was, look, as you say, intense, but also lovely at the same time. One of my favorite types of events are open source web developer events, where everybody's so friendly and involved and really passionate about what they do. And to give you one example, if you guys aren't using Web Profiler yet, you should go check it out, first of all, because it's an amazing contrib. And Luca Lusso, who's behind it, we literally had a coffee, I think on Tuesday morning or something, and we talked about Core Web Vitals. I wasn't hearing about them for the first time, but I kind of didn't really know what it was all about and how to get them into the module for developers to check them out on the page. And I showed him like a piece of JavaScript that was done for something else that just helped you handle the events. By Thursday, he was tweeting me saying, "Hey, look at this early prototype." I'm like,
Wow.
what have you been doing?
Wow.
Right. So first of all, big props to Luca and the rest of his team for that. But as the team said, this is just one example. This is exactly the kind of contribution and collaboration and ideas exchange that leads to meaningful and measurable improvements in developer processes, but also end user outcomes that we're looking for. And then in terms of the collaboration in more detail, I think, Tim, you covered this all really well. We need to identify key areas of focus. One, for example, really interesting one that we've been talking about quite a lot is Drupal's automated QA system and integrating performance checks based on Core Web Vitals fundamentally, for now at least, into Drupal's QA. So in my simple understanding, you cannot launch a slower page or a less performant page. Like Drupal will tell you, wait, what you just did, slowing it down. Don't do that. Do some other thing. Like here's some ways you can achieve what you're trying to achieve without hurting user experience, and do that in an automated way for everybody. Like that, that's a very ambitious end goal, and it'll probably take a few steps to get there. But that's one example of where I feel we can do a lot of really good work together.
Updating Drupal CI and our GitLab CI configurations to include Core Web Vital testing at the point of contribution to core and at the point of contrib module testing, right? So it's, again, we're not pushing the problem to individual shops, agencies, developers when they're working on an individual client site. We're trying to do it fundamentally in the platform. So I think that'll be powerful.
So Tim, are you saying like looking at a module's output or how it affects kind of like the Drupal front end and evaluating it based on the core vitals?
Yeah, basically, there's a variety of ways that we can do that kind of stuff. So, I mean, there's already, there's something like 99,800 PHP assertions in our core testing. We do some front end testing with Nightwatch. We do some JavaScript stuff, but what we don't have is a targeted artifact in the output that is, here are 3 simple metrics, in this case, the Core Web Vitals, that tell you if you have improved or degraded this performance-based user experience with this change. And doing something as simple as that, I think could make a big difference on an ongoing basis. Just making it more present so that, it doesn't have to be a separate initiative to say, hey, we're going to spend 6 months making things faster, and then maybe gradually they'll slowly creep and get slower again. We're going to do something that'll be sort of ever present.
One thing, if I may bring into this, right, talking about, since Tim gave me implicit permission to talk about this by bringing up our fellow open sourcians across the globe.
Yes, absolutely.
The experience we've had collaborating in the WordPress ecosystem, where after some initial trial and error and different approaches to how this can be even handled, because Google and the Chrome team in particular, and me as part of it, have learned a lot since we first started trying to engage with the open source development community, is spinning up eventually, not so long ago, a dedicated WordPress performance team for WordPress. Right? It just wasn't a thing that existed before. And it's not comprised solely of Googlers. It's some Googlers, plus a lot of people from the community and different agencies and hosting providers and so on collaborating together. And I think that model has been tremendously successful. And I personally am very much invested in looking forward to us being able to spin up either a mirror image or some Drupal flavored approach to this, where multiple companies, independent developers, larger entities are coming together to do exactly what Tim was talking about, but on a regular basis with clear goals.
Interesting. So it could possibly be it's not an exact analogy, but it could be something like the security team, right? Yes. Where there's a group of people focused on user experience and performance. And so if there's a module that maybe a good example might be, with the it's kind of related to the testing too. Like imagine if Views just added a random, let's wait for 10 seconds before giving the results, right? That would immediately be seen by anybody that updated there. But that's the kind of thing that the testing could catch. But if it's a more nuanced update, or let's say there's a MySQL update, like MySQL 8 is coming out now, and let's say that there's a performance degradation between 5 and 8 for Drupal. Having a dedicated performance team that can help work through some of those gnarly issues really could help the community and the web at large, because it just means that sites are going to be more performant. We're not degrading performance.
And what I think is interesting is we have the opportunity to extend the pattern that Andrey and his folks have managed to establish through a lot of trial and error and hard work with the WordPress team and has been successful doing, but also to extend some of the stuff that we already do in Drupal. It is very common. I don't know how much this is visible to other folks because there's kind of a core group of people who notices this, but almost every time there's a new version of PHP, it's actually the Drupal project that identifies several regressions or optimizations during the alpha, beta, and RC phases of those new versions of PHP. Like almost every release of PHP in the past 8 years, the Drupal community has wound up identifying something crucial before it got to its stable release. Because we do have some eyes in that way, not quite as formal as this, and not quite as like scoped in its goals, but it shows that there's opportunity.
Can one of you guys just take a minute to explain to our listeners what is this WordPress you keep bringing up? I'm kidding.
It's for writers who like to make coffee. They put the coffee in the press and then they write their words. It's a WordPress.
Listen, we appreciate all technologies and CMSs equally, but
Except for
okay. We're gonna leave that one alone. I'm
gonna get so much crap for this afterwards. Okay.
None of this is the final edition, by the way.
Yep.
Let's switch topics because the show title is Performance Privacy in the Open Web. Obviously, we've been talking about performance in the open web. Let's switch to privacy in the open web. Andrey, can you obviously privacy is like a huge topic, right? Again, we're talking about big topics here, but can you just give us an idea or an overview of how privacy impacts the open web?
Oh, where do I begin? I'm prepared. No, just merely kidding. So let's start with the scary stuff, and then we'll talk about some of the amazingly promising stuff. On the one hand, we've let ourselves, I was going to blame it on some third party, but there isn't really a third party here. We're all building the web together. And so we've let ourselves over the past few decades kind of do silly things with the web, just because the web lets you do a lot of things. And we've ended up building not even castles in the sand. Yes, I'm playing on something that's coming later. We built a bunch of castles in the sand, and we built a bunch of houses of cards, and whatever other analogy you want to build this on, where the foundations of the technologies that we're using right now, some of them are quite shaky in terms of how robust they can be as users become more aware and more present in their ownership of their online presence, right? And what I mean by this is a bunch of really hefty words. I'm surprised I even managed to put them all together. What am I saying? Like initially, our model of consuming the web was a bunch of words, somebody talking about words and press and coffee and all that stuff. You just put a bunch of words on a page, you upload it to a server, somebody comes and reads it, they can't even interact with it, they can't even give you a like, right? So the best you can do is maybe they send you an email saying how great or how poor it was. That was like 30 years ago or more. Definitely, that's not the Kansas that we're in anymore. We're in a web that's very interactive, where users expect the interactivity and the personalization. Right? You start talking to users about privacy concerns and sort of persistent advertising, and people might be a little bit wary of it. But you take away the personalization that they used to. Even your favorite example of IMDb, still go there, right? Because you have your wish list, say, and then this is like you used to consuming that kind of content in your particular way. People want it, but people also want to understand how it's done. And the way it's done right now, both in terms of advertising, but also fraud prevention, fraud detection, and spam prevention, and all of that, is built on a few really poorly matched technologies poorly matched for this purpose. So really good for the purposes they were introduced for. And by them, I mean specifically, really here in this case, it's cookies, right? It's user agent string delivered by the browser. And to some degree, it's the IP information about the user's IP address. Those are essential building blocks in some ways of how the web works in one hand. But what we built using those building blocks now resembles very little what they were initially intended for and are supposed to be used for. So how do we empower the users and developers to deliver the same level of personalized and useful solutions as people are, accustomed to, and maybe even expecting at a higher level of that, while preserving privacy and without breaking everything? That's where we started. That's where we started several years ago at Google and at Chrome in particular, and Android has joined in on that effort as well, and came up with this initiative that is called the Privacy Sandbox. You can read up more using the link in the show notes, which is, in my head, I simplify it to sort of 3 areas, right? I think the simplest way to think about it. First is this conceptual, almost philosophical level that I just talked about, is this desire to dramatically improve user privacy and controls over privacy for users because they deserve it, and many of them want it actively, and most of them want it even passively, even though they might not think about this every day. Second part of it is, because that philosophy is important, because everything that is done in this space is driven by that. Like if it doesn't match up to that standard, then it gets discarded. And the second element is all the technologies, I would say, that are not being fit for purpose, being either phased out entirely, and third-party cookies in Chrome are one example, or their use for specific purposes is being looked at again. And here we come to the user agent string and maybe IP information. That's number one. And at the same time, the browser is looking to produce solutions, APIs, but not only. Like some of them are more conceptual. We might get into a few examples, but okay, let's focus on APIs even here, that give the developer the functionality to deliver the personalized, targeted, and useful experience while maintaining user privacy, while retaining control over privacy in the user's hands without violating it and making it sustainable. So those are the three things here. First is, why is this all happening, which is critically important because what we have right now isn't quite sustainable on any level. 2, things that are going away. 3, things that are being brought in. So what this means for web developers right now is keeping track of what's going away and how the current solutions are being disrupted by that, and how they're being broken, and in what ways will they break if nothing is done. And then if they are being broken, if they are being disrupted, seeing, there's actually, it forks here, and I wish you could see my hands, but hey, this is a podcast. So it forks here. So imagine a fork. On the one hand, what new solutions do you need to replace the previous functionality? But also, and even more importantly for me, because this is where new money can be made, how can you use the new functionality that is being brought in to be even more effective, to be even more profitable in what you do? So
yeah.
Bit longer.
It's interesting because like it feels like one of those age old conundrums, right? Like we develop technology and like and these things, right? And we're like, hey, they have this one purpose, right? And then somebody says, well, actually, we can use that thing for like this purpose. And then it turns into like, I feel like everything boils down to this, but it's like a battle between good and evil, right? Like, hey, I have all this data. Now I can use it to do like creepy personalization on somebody to sell more widgets, or I can't, and I can try to use it, for quote unquote, air quotes, good, right?
Yeah.
So, I think it's an interesting problem. Go ahead, Nick.
One of the things that I think is at the core of this is making sure that users know what information about them is being tracked and and what purpose it's being used for. I think that's kind of the first big challenge is to surface that.
Yeah, and I think that's what right in line with what I was going to say, Randy, too. Like you need to define what privacy is, right? And for me, that means knowing who has what information, having control over who they share that information with. Like it's one thing to give some information to, your medical provider's app, and then but if they then share that somewhere else, that's a privacy violation. But if you are like, okay, I want to share it with this particular app, that's okay. Having the ability to revoke that access and purge, I think that's what it is. Like you said, Randy, like you need to be, privacy is about knowing what they're collecting, where they're collecting it, what they're using it for, and then having the ability to manage that yourself, right? Having the ability to be like, I don't use this service anymore, remove my information. Or say like, you can use my information, but only you can. You're not allowed to share that to service X, Y, Z.
You know what?
I mean,
I was gonna, like, if I may, right? Just
Sure.
come into that real quick. I think I have 2 points that could be interesting here. Number one is that a little bit like, and unsurprisingly, a little bit similar to the approach to user experience through the lens of Core Web Vitals. The Privacy Sandbox isn't trying to solve for all the privacy everywhere for everything, even on the web, right? It's saying, okay, there's, like, as you say, there's a whole bunch of different permission models and different sharing models that might or might not be affected specifically by the sandbox. But let's say, okay, we know the 3 things that we're looking at, and we know like a couple of dozen API-based and other solutions that we're introducing. That's the scope, right? The scope can change, but at least the scope right now is transparent and everybody understands what exactly we're dealing with. If there's other additional aspects that need to be addressed, they might or might not come into the scope, or they might be solved elsewhere. That's number one, right? It's important to, because I had those conversations a couple of times live as well. With the Privacy Sandbox, it's important to go and figure out and look at the website basically, and look at the overview and see what are we dealing with here and what are we not dealing with here. That's number one. And the second point that you really got me thinking about, but now I completely lost the track. I'll come back to it. Randy, you go make your point.
So I guess my last thought there, which a good one or a bad one, is like, on the web, is there really a expectation of privacy for users? Like, I feel like a lot of this is like, there are 2 schools of thought, right? There are people that like, no, I want my privacy on the web. I want to be able to like be a voyeur and watch and see and not like have any data captured about me. And then there are other people that are like, yeah, whatever. Like, I don't care. You're going to know what you know about me. And like, I'm on Facebook talking about my dog and like all this other stuff. Right. So it's interesting because I guess there's a middle ground somewhere, but to me, it kind of feels like maybe there isn't.
Yeah. I mean, there isn't a middle ground. The middle ground is the choice needs to be with the user on some level, I think. Right.
Yeah.
Like, if you want that information to be shared, that's fine. Like, nobody's saying that you can't share that. But right now, that choice isn't given to most consumers, right? That choice is, yeah, in the United States. And even if you try to remove your information from sites, you don't know where that was sold to, where it was used. So like, that choice doesn't exist. It's just the information is tracked, period.
And I'll add one more thing that I do think is important, though, because, and Andrey said this, and I don't think we should gloss over it. We talk about personalization, and we often point to sort of the creepy examples, but there's a feature under the umbrella, or there's a number of features under the umbrella of personalization that are very desirable for users, that even feel like part of owning their experience is dependent on that. So, right, if I'm on a social media platform and I am suddenly, and I have no information being fed back to that platform about my interests, then I may start to feel that I am being fed political information that does not align with my views, that I'm being fed advertising that is random and irrelevant, that I start having a degraded experience when in a context where I'm specifically looking for community, which requires tailoring and understanding shared interests. Yep. And so there is this, it's not just that, hey, you can use it for good ads and bad ads. It's also that there's this element of curation and moderation that can be done in part using some of these personalization tools. And when we talk about some of these spaces becoming, quote, free speech platforms, which become unmoderated and uncurated, it's not exactly the same, but there's this interesting parallel where when you talk about it, if we eliminate all opportunity for curation and personalization, we also get an experience that may not be what users desire. So just something
it's interesting Tim, that like personalization to me feels like something that should, going back to the top of the show, should enhance like performance and usability, right? It may not be the data and the numbers, but like it should make people want to use your website, your service, whatever. It should help them through whatever process you're trying to get them through, whatever you're trying to get them to understand.
So I want to kind of back up a moment, and I'd like to know, what is the Google Chrome Privacy Sandbox, and how can I get in there and play with like my little bucket and race cars?
Yeah, totally, exactly. And thanks for bringing this back up again. Hopefully, we've covered what it was just a few minutes ago, so don't need to go over that again. But very quickly, right? It's this philosophy about maintaining the success of the open web while enhancing user privacy controls. Then focusing on removing certain things or decreasing the availability of certain other signals, right? And you can see the details again, not that many, I can list them quickly. It's the cookies, it's IP information, and it's the user agent string in the browser, right? And it's the new solutions that are being introduced to maintain exactly what we started by saying. This was the new APIs and other adjacent solutions. Now, how do you get to play? This is the critical question, which I'm really happy we got to in the end, right? Because like with everything, like what we discussed just a few minutes ago on the performance side of things, like WebP as a format, and this is not privacy, back in performance line, WebP as a format gets introduced out in the wild. The proposal apparently has existed for 12 years, but it takes developers to implement the adoption. Somebody must come in and say, okay, now also we'll build in the code to make this image format available for my users, as opposed to some other, or in parallel with some other format. It is now critically important for us across all ecosystems, in particular open source, and in this case, in particular in Drupal, to start understanding how are we going to bring the new functionality into Drupal. Still, first step is to understand what exactly inside Drupal itself and all the websites might get affected, let's say, by third-party cookie deprecation or the user agent string reduction, right? So that we need to do an audit across the board. Like, how are our websites and our platform affected? And then we need to also look at the new solutions that are proposed, getting on those and say, okay, because first of all, this is all being discussed fully in the open. You can see that in the Privacy Sandbox website, links to all the proposals. They're all out there on GitHub, so you can come in, comment, do whatever you like with them, open issues, make suggestions, first of all, at the very basic level, saying, okay, conceptually, I believe that this solution should work like this. But after this conceptual level comes the implementation level. And let's say you have an API, right, that is out there. You need a contrib module, or you need to put it into Drupal core for it to be available to Drupal users. And this is where my largest request to the community comes in. This is where, in a similar way that we just discussed with performance, we need privacy-minded people, security-minded people in the community to come together and start looking at these things. What's available, how it can be brought into the platform. What's not available and should be created to exist on the platform, and so on. Right? This is the critical moment.
So to clarify, the Privacy Sandbox is something that a user of Chrome enables, like they opt into it, right?
No,
or is
right.
that
No, but like I'm glad to talk over it again and again. So again, and even the no is not the right answer. The sandbox, although it's a sandbox, it's called the sandbox, but it's an initiative, right? So it's not an actual sandbox that you enable.
It's a set of rules, basically, right?
Yes, well, but also, I mean, it's what it is.
Guidelines.
It's the name of the initiative within which the browser is doing certain things. It's saying, okay, like third-party cookies. That's an example. So the fact that third-party cookies on Chrome are being phased out is part of the Privacy Sandbox initiative.
Gotcha.
Got it.
Initiative, it has an element, and that's one of the elements. And then another bunch of elements are the different APIs that are being introduced. And then as to what the user enables and disables, then we can talk about this for hours. But this is similar to most other development.
Now it's clear to me.
Right. So for example, you got API proposals that might have an element of user controls. They might not need to, but some of them do, where there will be like a new option in the browser for a user to do something or see something that they haven't been able to do or see before. And on the other side, they would also have a developer element to it, where the developer would have to implement this API for the user to be able to see something or do something, and so on. Or maybe in some cases, if a developer doesn't do anything, then a user making a choice will impact what kind of experience the developer is delivering. So it's complicated and varied, and it depends, because we have so many aspects of the web experience affected. We have advertising technologies, measurement technologies, anti-fraud, all sorts of other things affected. And so there's no one single way to explain this. But the Sandbox itself, to make it simple, is the initiative that encompasses all these changes.
Makes sense.
Excellent. Well, I'm really glad I asked that question. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, Andrey and Tim, thank you for joining us. This has been an extremely enlightening show. I mean, I personally have learned so much about how Google and kind of the Drupal project are thinking about both performance and privacy. So I appreciate both of you joining us today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and I really enjoyed my time with you guys.
Thank you.
Do you have questions or feedback? Reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
And you can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. You can learn more at talkingdrupal.com/tdpromo.
Get the Talking Drupal newsletter for show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, and much more. Sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choose Become a Patron. And Andrey, if our listeners wanted to get in touch with you, what would be the best way to do that?
Find me on Twitter, find me on LinkedIn, just my first and last name. It shouldn't be that difficult. I'm just at Andrey Lipattsev on both.
Awesome. And Tim, how about you?
You can find me on Drupal.org and Drupal Slack as Hestenet, or email me directly, tim@association.drupal.org. And if you're not a Drupal Association member, I'd love to encourage you to sign up at Drupal.org/association.
And Randy, how about you?
Sure. You can find me on Twitter, at least for now, as Amazing Rando. And you can also find me on Drupal.org and Drupal Slack, also as Amazing Rando.
And John, how about you?
You can find me on all the major social networks and Drupal.org at John Picozzi, and you can find out about EPAM at epam.com.
And you can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, NICXVAN.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. Thanks, everyone.
See you guys next week.
Bye.